No way. Ooh, interesting. Okay, well then maybe I should just go home, right? Because you guys are guys. Okay, so before I try and ask that question, I'm going to start off with a story. Okay. So, first off, a spaceship made mostly of aluminium is launched by the United States from a base in Florida. 3 astronauts head to the moon, they return safely to Earth, and their spaceship crashes down in the ocean. Sounds like a history lesson, right? Well, this isn't just the story of 1969. This is also the plot of the 1865 novel by Jules Verne called From the Earth to the Moon. And even though it was written over 100 years before the Apollo missions, it still serves as a pretty accurate novelization of humanity's first mission to the moon, down to some of the craziest details, like the cost of the rocket. He got kind of bang on if you account for inflation, which is kind of crazy. The weight of the rocket, like within an order of magnitude, is kind of bang on as well, which is kind of crazy. The launch site, he predicted it would be the first mission to the moon would be launched from Florida. There'd be 3 astronauts. I could go on. There were loads of really crazy kind of coincidences in this story. But Verne didn't get everything exactly right. Okay, so as we know, the Apollo mission astronauts went up in a Saturn V. They were launched out of a traditional space rocket that threw them safely up towards the moon. In Verne's story, his astronauts are fired out of a giant space cannon, okay? And so it's kind of cool. He spends a whole chapter of the book, it's not the most exciting chapter, where he talks about what kind of gunpowder you should use to launch a cannon to the moon, to try and make this story as realistic as possible. And that's just one example of where Verne spends a lot of time thinking about the science, the technology, trying to do the math to make this kind of story as realistic as possible. And it pays off, given all these kind of wonderful coincidences that I talked about previously. So this is a great example of a sci-fi story that has worked really hard to get it right, and it pays off. And there are other sci-fi stories which kind of predict the future in perhaps eerie ways that you might not expect. So my next example for you guys is a story called Project Mars, a technical tale. And this was written by Dr. Werner von Braun in the 1940s. So von Braun was a Nazi rocketry engineer who was brought over to the United States after the Second World War. And he was a pioneer in the space race. He helped build the Saturn V. He was one of the NASA's kind of primary engineers. And as well as being a kind of huge support towards making the US space missions a success, he was also a huge advocate of sending humans to Mars. And he did a lot of talking and kind of thinking about the technical and engineering challenges that you might have with sending people to our nearest neighbor planet. And as well as this, he also wrote a science fiction story where he envisioned the first trip that humans would go on to travel to Mars. And so, by way of background, his story is written in the 1940s. It's set in 1980, okay? The United States of Earth have finally found peace. I know. If only it was true, right? A artificial moon called Luneta orbits the Earth, pretty much exactly like the International Space Station does these days. And we discover that there are people living on Mars, okay? And this story was kind of written in a time where astronomers would look up at Mars and they'd see what they thought were these artificial canals on the surface of the red planet, which we now know to be a complete figment of their imagination. But Verne ran with this idea and he thought, okay, what would happen if Earthlings traveled to Mars? And what might the Martian civilization look like? And so he talks about a number of different things, and the one that came up when I was reading this story, which I thought was kind of remarkable, was when he's talking about the Martian leadership. So I'm just going to quote directly from the story, just to make sure that you guys don't think I'm making this up. But in the story, Verne talks about the first meeting between the Earth leaders and the Martian leaders, and he describes what the Martian government is like. And he says, "The Martian government was directed by 10 men, the leader of whom was elected by universal suffrage for 5 years and entitled Elon." Okay. Coincidence? I don't think so, right? I mean, when I read this, I was like, nah, surely not. And I went to like the PDF of the book, and this was written in the 1940s, okay, so Like, way, way ahead of his time, von Braun thought that the leader of the Martian government would be called Elon, so who knows what's going to happen. Okay, next example for you guys. I don't know if anyone recognizes this lovely creature that you have on your screen. Maybe? Yes? No? Okay, cool. Well, this is the wonderfully named Oumuamua. This is the first interstellar asteroid that was discovered, and it's an interstellar asteroid, which means it's the first kind of planetary body that we've seen that has entered our solar system from beyond. And it's got this really classical kind of cigar-like shape, and it's really unlike anything that we've ever seen before. That is, of course, unless you've read Rendezvous with Rama, which is a science fiction story that was written in the 1970s. And this tells the tale of astronomers looking for near-Earth asteroids that might end up hitting the Earth, and they discover a giant cylindrical asteroid. What they think is a giant cylindrical asteroid, but actually turns out to be a giant alien spaceship. So I've got my fingers crossed that good old Oumuamua has got some secrets in store for us, but we'll see. Okay, and obviously I can't do a talk about science fiction but in the future without mentioning the incredible technology that we've seen from different sci-fi stories. And one example obviously that stands out is the computer. So you can see here, in 2001, A Space Odyssey, which is a series of stories by Arthur C. Clarke, the users or the characters in the story use these flat screen computers to learn about information that comes in from all over the world, exactly the same way that iPads and computer tablets do today. Except again, the story was written in the 1960s, before we had kind of computers on any kind of scale that Arthur C. Clarke could have envisioned. You can also see here that Star Trek predicted the cell phone way ahead of its time, and maybe the flip phone is going to make a comeback in the 23rd century. I don't know. We'll see about that one. And the one that I thought was most remarkable was this novel I found called Ralph 124C41+, which is an interesting name for a story. But it's set in the year 2660, and in it the characters use these devices which look exactly like what you see nowadays, like using Skype or video calls, which allows the characters to communicate with each other and see and hear each other from other sides of the world. Except for this story was written in 1911, before we had internet, before we had television, and it's really incredible to see sci-fi writers with such fantastic imaginations coming up with these kind of technologies that we kind of take for granted today. And I've kind of gone through a couple of kind of nice examples where sci-fi predictions have come true, but as you all know, unfortunately, for every prediction that's worked out, there's one or two, or maybe 3 or 4 or 5 that haven't quite worked out the way we would want them to, okay? So personally, I feel like Star Trek has seriously overpromised and underdelivered on teleportation. That's really let me down. And you can't buy a hoverboard off Amazon yet. And I did check, and those kind of hands-free Segway things you see people rolling around on definitely don't count. If you're not floating along the air, it's not Back to the Future stuff. But at the same time, we also don't have Martians invading our planet. We don't have robots taking over the world. And we don't have a giant Death Star looming over us. So maybe it's not such a bad thing that every sci-fi prediction hasn't exactly panned out the way that it was predicted. And I thought it would be kind of fun to look at what human history might look like if some of these sci-fi predictions had come true. So here is a human timeline according to science fiction. So we're going to start off at the beginning with From the Earth to the Moon by Jules Verne. And this predicts in the 1860s that we'll be sending humans to the moon. Okay? And this is quickly followed by our first Martian invasion, as predicted by H.G. Wells, War of the Worlds. It takes us a few decades to recover, but apparently we bounce back, and according to Arthur C. Clarke, we should have our first lunar settlement on the moon in the 1990s, quickly followed by human space travel to the outer solar system in the kind of beginning of the millennium. If we start looking forward at our kind of predicted trajectory according to science fiction, by the 2030s we should have humans, or at least Matt Damon, on Mars. Moving forward a little bit further to the mid-21st century, Christopher Nolan and co. predict that we should have interstellar travel locked down. Star Trek predicts by the 23rd century we should have humanity being a multi-planetary species, and life should be abundant throughout the cosmos. And all of these sci-fi predictions for humanity culminate in the year 2805, when the Earth is just an abandoned planet covered in trash, with just a little lonely Wally. Okay, so this kind of paints a little bleak picture of sci-fi predictions, or maybe kind of humanity not quite doing as well as these optimistic sci-fi writers envisaged that we might do. But don't panic, there's still loads of really cool sci-fi to get excited about. And I want to touch on just a few examples of where science fiction of the past has become, or is becoming, reality today. So the first of these is solar sailing. So the idea behind solar sailing is really simple. You use light and the momentum that it provides to propel you through space. Okay? So exactly the same way that you use a sailing boat uses the wind, a light sail, as kind of pictured here, uses the sun's light to kind of drive it forward. And this idea has been explored in numerous different sci-fi stories, one example of which is a novel called The Sunjammer by Arthur C. Clarke, and it tells the tale of a group of, I think, school kids kind of racing from the Earth to the Moon using these light sails. And this is a technology that is now becoming a reality thanks to an organisation called the Planetary Society, which we've got some members over here in the corner. So the Planetary Society is headquartered in Pasadena, just outside of LA. And they're going to be launching later this year a prototype light sail. And so there's a picture of it up here. It's what looks like a giant sheet of tinfoil. I promise it's not actually made of tinfoil. It's about the size of a boxing ring when it unfurls. And the idea is that it's going to be launched on the next Falcon Heavy. It will unfurl in space, and it will orbit around the Earth as a kind of proof of concept to show that this technology is viable. And so this is kind of really exciting because it is showcasing a new way of traveling through space that we haven't really ever been able to do before. And kind of extrapolating on that idea, another kind of popular theme in science fiction is interstellar travel. So just one example here is kind of the movie Interstellar Travel. That's not called Interstellar Travel, is it? Just Interstellar. That's got a much better ring to it. Okay. So the movie Interstellar tells the tale of McConaughey and co. using this crazy wormhole network to explore other stars and trying to find the next habitable planet. And even though we haven't quite cracked that black hole or whatever technology it is that they use to go to these different stars, there are some really exciting projects in the works right now which are trying to make interstellar travel a reality. And one example of this is an organization called Breakthrough Starshot, which is led by Russian billionaire Yuri Milner, who is dramatically holding up one of his nanocrafts. And the idea here is to use, again, this kind of solar technology to power these really small devices, accelerate them up to close to the speed of light, which will enable us to get to Proxima Centauri, which is our nearest neighbour star, within a decade. So that's kind of really exciting, and it's using the same kind of technology that the Planetary Society's light sail will be using, and taking it one step further to hopefully allow us to travel to distant stars. Okay. Another example of science fiction becoming a reality is a moon village. And I'm always a little bit apprehensive about talking about this one because I feel like people in the 60s and 70s probably said the exact same thing, you know? They just landed on the moon and they were like, yes, what's next? We're going to have a village. It's going to be awesome. And then it didn't happen. But I predict that this time it will be different and that we may now be closer than we ever have been before to seeing a village on the moon. And there's a few reasons for that. So the first of which is last year Trump signed the Space Policy Directive, which signaled a concerted effort by NASA and the US to send humans back to the moon, as well as crewed missions to Mars and beyond. And the European Space Agency is one step ahead, in terms of vision at least, and one of their flagship projects is the so-called Moon Village. And the idea of this is to facilitate a local hub on the moon, whereby organizations and agencies from across the world can pool their resources and establish a permanent lunar settlement which will allow for robotic and human exploration on the moon, which is kind of exciting, right? So I've talked about solar sailing, interstellar travel, villages on the moon, and all these things kind of sound really ambitious, right? And maybe I'm a little bit optimistic to think that all of these are going to be happening in my lifetime. But I think it's good to be optimistic and preferably, well, I think it's really important to have pioneers like Elon Musk or Yuri Milner or Jeff Bezos trying to push these somewhat crazy ideas forward and making them happen. And preferably if they're pioneers who've got a shit ton of funding behind them who can kind of make this stuff happen. But if I go back to my original question, which was, can science fiction predict the future? I think the answer to that is probably going to have to be, on the whole, maybe yes, maybe no. There's lots of wonderful examples of sci-fi coming through, but there's also lots of examples of where sci-fi has been either really, really ambitious or really, really undershot itself. And so I think that's okay, because the important thing about science fiction is it's not meant to predict the future. And often sci-fi is much more reflective of the era in which it's written, more than anything else. And what makes science fiction so important is the inspiration that it provides. So Jeff Bezos, Amazon CEO, pioneer of Blue Origin, has often cited Asimov and other sci-fi stories as inspiring him to get involved in space travel. Elon Musk was similarly inspired by Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. You saw the kind of don't panic sign on the Tesla as it was flying into space. Tolosky, who was one of the fathers of modern rocketry, cited H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds as one of his key inspirations. And in fact, the space module that took the first 3 US astronauts to the moon was called the Columbia, which was in part named after the Columbiad rocket from Jules Verne's novel. And for me, it was the novel Contact by Carl Sagan that inspired me to study planetary science and ultimately led me to be here in California studying our solar system. And I'm sure there's plenty of people in the audience who have got their favorite sci-fi stories that I haven't even been able to touch on in this very short presentation, who have kind of been similarly inspired and encouraged to follow their interests in space and science thanks to sci-fi. And maybe somewhere out there is a kid with these kind of interplanetary travel posters on their walls who becomes similarly inspired and one day becomes the first human to travel to another star system. So if we want to find out what the future is going to look like, and we can't necessarily use science fiction, then what do we do? And the answer to that, I think, I'm going to leave you with this final quote, is the best way to predict the future is to invent it yourself. So, thank you very much.
Keep it going for Harriet. Do we have any questions for Harriet in the room?
Questions, please.
Questions? All right.
I can't see any of you, so
coming over
as long as I
here,
can hear.
on your left.
Science fiction is probably the only major genre that's written in a very different time than our own. You could write science fiction that was set in the past, but generally it's far in the future. Mm-hmm. And usually the focus is on the science of it, but obviously it's far in the future. The society is different.
Yeah.
And some writers touch on this a little more than others, and you see some dystopian futures and some utopian futures. So my question is do you think it's a responsibility of a science fiction writer to pay more attention to the structure of a future society and maybe paint utopian pictures more than the science of it?
Yeah, maybe they should be a little bit more optimistic in the future. I don't know. It's a very interesting question because you see some of these kind of science fiction stories that were written in the past where some aspects of the stories are really, really well developed, right? Like Jules Verne from the Earth to the Moon, right? But at the end of the day, it's still a bunch of men trying to go and build these rockets. And like, there's literally no women in the story, right? Because like, why would there be in the 1800s? And you see this in kind of a lot of different sci-fi stories where maybe the technology is really far advanced, but a lot of social norms of that time are reflected in the story, and they don't really think about pushing those ideals forward as much. It's a very interesting question. I think maybe science fiction, I mean, it really depends what you want to read, right? There's a lot of different parts of sci-fi and society-fi. Yeah, maybe that's a new genre that we should invent. I don't know, but yeah, we should see. It's a good question.
All the way in the back towards the bar.
Hi. I I have a question. The talk, does science fiction inspire the future? Does the future look back on science fiction and say, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we had those handheld iPads from 2001? Do you think that's a possibility of it? That we look at something and go, wow, flip phone communicators would be bitchin'. Thus the Motorola StarTAC. So, I mean, does science fiction, does it predict, does it create itself?
Yeah,
like that quote says.
Yeah, I really do think it does, and I think the main way that it does that is not necessarily by explicitly, like, oh, I read this cool sci-fi story and I'm going to make it true, but it's probably more like, if you talk to, I don't know, like anyone at JPL, right, or anyone at Caltech, or anyone who is kind of involved in science in a big way, most of them can cite a sci-fi story that has inspired them in some way to do what they're doing right now. And so, one, there's this kind of implicit inspiration, and two, you're right, there's exactly this thing, like, oh, wouldn't it be really cool if we had a device like we did in Star Trek? And that's exactly what happened with one of the Global X Prizes. One of the competitions was to build this kind of transponder that was originated from Star Trek idea, where oh, wouldn't it be great if you had a small handheld device that could diagnose basic medical kind of malfunctions, right? And so they thought, yeah, let's set up a prize and let's see if someone can actually solve this problem. And a team won this competition, I think last year, with a handheld device that could do basically exactly what Star Trek predicted it could. So the answer to that, I think, is yes, which is kind of cool.
Next question is also by the bar.
Harriet, a great talk, terrific. And the question is this: what is your take on the nasty science fiction stuff? 1984, George Orwell, and of course Fahrenheit number whatever by Mr. Bradbury.
Yeah, it was Fahrenheit 451. Have I got that right? Yeah. Okay. Cool. Okay. Cool. I can still do this talk in the future. Yeah, you raise a really good point, and maybe I should have thought of 1984 when the person asked the question about society in the future, because that is a great example of a story that is set in the future that comments on society in a kind of very disturbing, very profound way. So I think it's good that we have a variety of science fiction, some that is optimistic, some that maybe is kind of a little bit more depressing, but can kind of warn us about what might happen in the future if we don't pay attention and think about where we're going forward. But yeah, good question. Thank you.
Any more questions? Anyone? Shout out to me.
I have a question, Nite.
Oh, coming up towards the front, walking with my legs.
Thanks for making the journey, Nick. Yeah, no problem. So you are currently getting your PhD in planetary sciences, I know from your bio.
Yes.
What inspired you to go and get your PhD?
That's a great question. So I actually had a slightly roundabout route to coming back into grad school. I was a math major in college. I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life, so I went and worked in a bank for 4 years. And I was living in New York and decided that I was kind of, I had this free time and I was like, what should I do? I really love space, so I'm going to try and find cool space things to do in New York. And I went to the Hayden Planetarium, which is headed up by Neil deGrasse Tyson, went to some incredible talks, and I realized that space is really, really cool. And in the past, I thought, you know what, this is a super interesting subject, but it's just a hobby. There's no way I can do this as a real job. I'm not going to become an astronaut, and that's kind of all there is to it. And the more I kind of got involved in it as a hobby, the more I realized that there's so much you can do in the space industry. You can be a science journalist. You can be a space lawyer. These people actually exist. It's awesome. You can work in basically any field and be involved in the space world. And so I decided at that point that maybe working in a bank for the rest of my life wasn't for me. So I went back to grad school. I went back to school, and that's where I am now. Thank you very much.
One more time for Harriet, everyone. Thank you so much, Harriet. Cool. At this time, we're going to take a short break, get another drink, go to the bathroom.